It's a late summer afternoon in 1100. King William II of England rides into the lush thickets of the New Forest chasing a stag. By sunset, the 43-year-old monarch lies dead on the forest floor, an arrow through his chest. It sounds like a scene from a fantasy drama, a royal hunting quote-unquote accident worthy of Game of Thrones. But this was the grim reality for the king known as William Rufus. The mysterious circumstances of his death have fueled speculation for almost a millennia, and will probably keep doing so for another 1,000 years after. William II, commonly called William Rufus for his ruddy complexion or his red hair, was the third son of William the Conqueror. When his father died in 1087, he split his domains between his sons. The eldest, Robert, inherited Normandy, while William Rufus received the crown of England. The youngest brother, Henry, got a hefty monetary inheritance, but was left devoid of any meaningful holdings. William II ruled England from 1087 until that ominous day in 1100, carrying on his father's Norman legacy. He never married and left no children, a fact that meant a brother would be his heir, a detail that later raised eyebrows when William suddenly died. In his day, William II was a bold and stern ruler. He was no saintly king, quite the opposite if you believe the chronicles. He was described by contemporaries as being addicted to every vice imaginable, in an era where kings were supposed to be moral exemplars. He quarreled fiercely with the church, even driving the revered Archbishop Anselm into exile over disputes about church authority. The monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle painted him in the bleakest colors, saying William was, quote, hated by almost all his people and abhorrent to God. Yet for all his vices, William Rufus was an effective monarch in many ways. He kept order in his realm and extended Norman control into Wales and even over the Scottish king. At the start of the First Crusade, Robert pawned Normandy to him so he could partake in the expedition, a fact that's important to keep in mind going forward. William's reign was significant in consolidating Norman rule, but it was also marked by rebellion, heavy taxation, and mistrust between the king and powerful nobles and churchmen. By the summer of 1100, tensions and intrigues swirled around the crown. William's elder brother Robert was still overseas, returning from the First Crusade. His younger brother Henry remained in court, ambitious and waiting in the wings. It was against this backdrop that King William II set out on a hunting expedition that would cost him his life. On August 2nd, 1100, King William rode out from Winchester Castle for a day of hunting in the New Forest of Hampshire. The royal party included William's younger brother Prince Henry and a number of noble companions, among them a knight named Sir Walter Tyrrell. Hunting was a favorite sport of the king, but it was also dangerous. In fact, William's own older brother Richard had been killed in a hunting accident in the New Forest years earlier. He literally hit his head on a branch and died, a freak accident that led to the belief amongst locals that the Anglo-Saxons had cursed these woods. Superstitions aside, the stage was set for high drama in the woods. As the hunt commenced, the party spread out to chase game through the woods. King William and Sir Walter found themselves riding together apart from the others. According to later chroniclers, ominous signs had tried to halt the king that day. One monk reportedly warned William of a nightmare predicting his death if he hunted, but the headstrong king laughed it off. The sun began to dip low, casting blinding shafts of light between the trees. A stag bolted past the king, and William drew his bow and loosed an arrow, nicking the animal but not bringing it down. Eager to finish the hunt, he shouted for Sir Walter to take a shot. Sir Walter let fly an arrow, but rather than striking down a stag, the arrow found itself stuck in William's chest, puncturing his lung. Shocked and reeling, the king managed to break off the protruding shaft, but collapsed on the spot, bleeding out rapidly. It was all over in moments, and the King of England lay dead on the forest floor. Sir Walter rushed to the fallen king's side, but there was nothing to be done, and panic set in among the hunters. After it became clear he couldn't do a thing, Sir Walter immediately mounted his horse and fled the scene. The rest of the hunting party, including Prince Henry, also scattered in alarm, and not one of them stayed with William's body. Later that day, some local peasants stumbled upon the king's corpse, which I assume was a tale which was passed down in their families for generations. In a humble cart, they bore William's body to Winchester Cathedral. The once mighty monarch was buried the next day under a plain marble slab with shockingly little ceremony. The unseemly haste and lack of dignity in his burial didn't go unnoticed, and it was as if everyone just wanted to move on, and quickly. News of King William II's death sent ripples of astonishment through the kingdom. Almost immediately, whispers that the whole thing had been a setup began. After all, William's younger brother Henry had been present at the scene and stood to gain immensely from William's demise. With the king dead and the eldest brother Robert absent in the Holy Land, Henry moved with breathtaking speed. He didn't linger to mourn. In fact, Henry abandoned his brother's body where it fell and raced off to secure power for himself. He rode straight to Winchester, seized control of the royal treasury, and by the very next day had himself proclaimed king. 3 days after William's death, before Robert could return to assert his own claim, Henry was crowned King Henry I of England. He even bypassed waiting for the Archbishop of Canterbury and had the Bishop of London crown him, so urgent was his grab for the throne. Such ruthless efficiency raised eyebrows, and convenient barely begins to describe Henry's windfall. And it's very important to remember here that as a younger son, he had a much less legitimate claim to the throne than his Crusader brother, who was also Duke of Normandy. As contemporaries observed, he seemed to know exactly what to do to seize the levers of power the moment William was eliminated. Could Prince Henry have orchestrated his brother's death? Medieval chroniclers were cautious. None openly accused Henry of regicide, perhaps because accusing a king was dangerous. Instead, church chroniclers framed William's fall as God's judgment on an impious ruler, but rumors quietly persisted. People noticed troubling details. For instance, why was Sir Walter Tyrrell never charged or even formally accused? Contemporaries thought that surely he had at the very least let loose the arrow that struck down the king in such a negligent way as to deserve punishment. In fact, Tyrrell escaped to France and suffered no punishment at all. Despite his escape, King Henry left his vast estates in England intact, and they were passed to his heirs without any problem. This seemed extraordinary, given that he had literally shot down a king, albeit supposedly by misfortune. Years later, Sir Walter himself vehemently denied guilt in the king's death, swearing under oath that it was not by his hand. He claimed that another arrow hit the king while they were out that day. Putting that aside, others noted how Henry immediately honored and rewarded certain nobles who had been in the hunting party. Many have questioned whether these payments weren't to ensure loyalty to the new king, but rather to secure silence. Opinions amongst modern historians remain heavily divided, much as they have since 1100. On one hand, many argue that William's death was simply a mishap of the hunt. Hunting was always a risky activity in medieval Europe, and going into the New Forest, thick with oak, was no different. People can get lost in the adrenaline of the chase and fire an arrow without calculating where it may go if it doesn't hit its mark. That said, the assassination theory refuses to disappear, and not without reason. The chain of events is almost too perfect in benefiting Henry. With Robert still abroad, William's quote-unquote accident removed the one obstacle between Henry and the throne. Given that he was on his return from the First Crusade, the timing was perhaps just a little too perfect. After all, Robert was the Duke of Normandy, with substantial continental holdings, while Prince Henry was wealthy, but virtually landless. Whether the event was a simple accident that changed the course, or the result of a larger plot, will likely never be fully resolved. All that said, the timing was too perfect for Prince Henry, and his subsequent actions do speak to his guilt. That said, perhaps Prince Henry was simply a man who wasn't willing to let a good crisis go to waste. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who's a fan of English or medieval history. In the early 13th century, a royal mystery unfolded that would haunt the reign of King John of England. In April 1203, Arthur of Brittany, a teenager with a claim to the English throne, vanished without a trace while imprisoned by his own uncle. Arthur's disappearance sent shockwaves through England and France, altering the political landscape and earning King John infamy for treachery. Arthur of Brittany was born in 1187 into the tumultuous Angevin royal family. He was the posthumous son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, the fourth son of King Henry II of England, and Constance, Duchess of Brittany. This made Arthur a grandson of Henry II, and importantly, a nephew of King Richard the Lionheart and King John. In fact, as the son of an older brother of John, young Arthur had a strong claim to the English crown under the principle of primogeniture, inheritance through the eldest line. Further complicating things was the fact that King Richard the Lionheart had once acknowledged Arthur as his heir presumptive in 1190 in the absence of his own legitimate children. Since Richard ended up dying without a legitimate heir, Arthur represented the next generation. However, politics shifted in the 1190s, and Arthur was raised at the French court of King Philip II. Philip saw this as an opportunity to use the boy to fracture the Angevin Empire. By 1199, when Richard the Lionheart died, two candidates stood for the throne of England: John, Richard's younger brother, and Arthur, Richard's 12-year-old nephew. The question of succession was hotly contested, as medieval law was unclear and power often went to the swift and strong rather than the closest in blood. In the years leading up to his death, Richard ultimately preferred John as his heir, despite earlier proclamations, reportedly feeling Arthur was too young to rule in a dangerous time. John, aged roughly 32, had himself crowned in England and secured the support of many Norman and English barons. But in the French territories of the Plantagenet Empire, many saw Arthur as the rightful heir. He was backed by King Philip II of France, who recognized Arthur's claim to vast and wealthy provinces like Brittany, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine. As such, the boy became a rallying figure for non-Norman continental nobles resisting John. In 1299 and 1200, a succession crisis turned into a tug-of-war, with Philip II scheming to profit from the discord. John moved swiftly to consolidate power. In 1200, he struck a deal with Philip II that temporarily brought peace. Philip recognized John as King of England and feudal lord in Normandy. John, for his part, conceded some lands and favors to Philip. This truce sidelined Arthur's immediate ambitions, and for a brief moment the young duke even appears to have been on cordial terms with John. However, this peace was short-lived. By 1202, John's heavy-handed tactics in Angevin French territory gave Philip II an excuse to resume hostilities. Philip declared John's French fiefs forfeit and again championed Arthur's cause. The war reignited in 1202. Philip invaded Normandy from the east, while Arthur, now about 15, led an attack in Poitou to the south. In July 1202, Arthur and his French allies besieged a castle in Poitou, where Arthur's own grandmother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's mother, was trapped. This daring move proved Arthur's resolve to claim his inheritance, but it also led to his downfall. King John, often criticized for his military ineptitude and general lack of foresight, reacted with uncharacteristic speed and cunning. Marching overnight to relieve the siege, John surprised Arthur's forces on August 1st, 1202. The result was a complete rout of the rebels. The young Duke of Brittany was captured by John's troops, Eleanor of Aquitaine was saved, and John took many prisoners that day. Contemporary accounts note that Arthur was taken in chains to the strong castle of Falaise in Normandy. This victory was a high point of John's reign since he had eliminated the immediate threat by his rival heir. However, this gave rise to the immediate question what to do with Arthur, as executing a close family member for pressing a contested claim was considered socially unacceptable. Despite that, the teenager was a dangerous figurehead. As long as he lived, and even in captivity, Arthur's claim could inspire rebellions from unhappy continental nobles. King John faced a stark choice: spare his teenage nephew and risk future uprisings, or permanently remove this threat to his throne. John's treatment of Arthur soon demonstrated the depths of his ruthlessness. At Falaise, Arthur was placed under the guard of Hubert de Burgh, one of John's trusted knights and retainers. According to Ralph of Coggeshall, a chronicler writing at the time, King John didn't intend to simply keep Arthur as a bargaining chip. Coggeshall records that John ordered Hubert to blind and castrate Arthur, a shocking command even by medieval standards. In that era, in Western Europe, it was generally unheard of for a high-born captive, especially a prince of royal blood, to be mutilated. Noble prisoners were usually held for ransom or political leverage and treated honorably while in custody. John's neutering order violated the chivalric codes of war, underscoring how badly he wanted Arthur neutralized. Hubert de Burgh, to his credit, refused to carry out such a cruel deed. He could not bring himself to maim the young duke in such a disgusting way. Instead, Hubert spread a false rumor that Arthur had died of natural causes, hoping to appease John, or at least buy time. Unfortunately, this ploy backfired. When news reached Arthur's native Brittany that the captive duke was quote-unquote dead, the Bretons erupted in anger, suspecting foul play. Far from quelling unrest, the rumor of Arthur's death only inflamed it. John realized that Arthur being alive and Arthur rumored dead were both rallying points for rebellion, and so long as the Bretons did not see Arthur safe, they would fear the worst. Sometime in late 1202, John decided to move Arthur to a more secure location. The young prisoner was transferred to the towering fortress of Rouen, the capital of Normandy, early in 1203. There, Arthur was placed in the custody of William de Bruce, the same baron who had helped capture him. Rouen Castle, with its thick walls above the river Seine, was a royal stronghold where John could better control the boy's fate. As spring 1203 arrived, King John's fortunes in France were deteriorating. Philip II was winning victories in Normandy. It was against this turbulent backdrop that Arthur of Brittany disappeared. By April 1203, the 15-year-old duke simply vanished from Rouen. There were no official announcements of his death, no body was displayed, and no public funeral was held. Arthur, once a pawn in a war between kings, was now just simply gone, and apparently memory hold. His sister Eleanor was quietly kept prisoner in England for years to ensure no other rival claims emerged. But of Arthur, nothing more was heard after April 1203, and the sudden silence was as ominous as it was deafening. Whispers spread in both England and France that King John had disposed of his nephew in the darkest way imaginable. The mysterious fate of Arthur of Brittany spawned numerous theories, both among contemporaries and in later retellings. Contemporary chroniclers were extremely cautious in recording the event. Some, like Roger of Wendover in England, noted simply that Arthur disappeared in 1203, offering no details, a stark admission of uncertainty. Others, however, directly accused King John of slaying his nephew. The annals of Margam Abbey in Wales, for instance, give a chilling account. According to this telling, after keeping Arthur alive in Rouen for some time, King John, deep in his cups, bludgeoned the captive Arthur personally and had his corpse tossed in the river Seine. A French chronicler independently recounted a similar story stating that John slew Arthur and threw the corpse into the river. These claims, if true, mark one of the most heinous crimes in English royal history. An uncle and sitting king, divinely ordained by the Lord to rule, slaying his own vassal, of ducal status no less, who happened to be his own nephew, to shore up the security of his throne. To put it in terms the average Crusader King's player can understand, the tales of John's misdeeds were known from Ireland to Cathay. But not all stories put the dagger directly in King John's hand. Another theory posits that John ordered Arthur snuffed out quietly by his henchmen. In this vein, rumors swirled around the role of William de Bruce, Arthur's jailer at Rouen. William de Bruce was a close associate of John, and after Arthur vanished, the king heaped rewards on him, granting him new lands and titles in the years following 1203. This raised suspicions that de Bruce was being richly rewarded for doing John's dirty work. In 1208, as King John's power began to unravel, William de Bruce's wife, Lady Matilda, publicly accused John of the worst sin. She publicly declared that John had slain his own nephew Arthur. This accusation was extraordinary, a noblewoman directly blaming the king for Arthur's death, and it did not go unpunished. Enraged, John swiftly moved against the de Bruce family. Matilda and her eldest son were captured and imprisoned in harsh conditions, and by 1210, they had been starved to death on King John's orders. This disturbing act strongly suggested to contemporaries that Matilda's charge was true, and that John would destroy anyone who dared voice that dark secret. There were also alternative tales of Arthur's fate that didn't involve such deliberate cruelty. One such story is essentially an accidental death theory. This account found its most famous expression in literature rather than in medieval chronicles. William Shakespeare, in his historical play King John, dramatized Arthur's demise in a tragic accident. In the play, Arthur is depicted as trying to escape captivity. The panicked Arthur attempts to flee his tower prison and falls to his death from the high window. Some historians believe that this was a popular rumor that had developed in the centuries after the death of Arthur. Other historians, however, believe that this was invented so as not to portray a king of England as a complete monster, while also still indicating that King John played a part. Notably, King Philip II of France either believed something sinister had happened or was smart enough to capitalize upon this wide belief. Philip had been using Arthur's cause as a political weapon, and when Arthur vanished, Philip summoned John to appear at the French court to answer for his nephew's fate. And let me just briefly explain how King Philip had this authority to summon a fellow king. King John was a vassal to the King of France for his French lands like Normandy and Aquitaine. Though he was completely sovereign in England itself, and in his role as English king, his continental titles required him to pay homage to the French king and respond to his summons. Interestingly, this is one of many reasons that historians can get more than a little uncomfortable with calling the Plantagenet kingdom the Angevin Empire. Despite this feudal relationship, John refused to appear and explain himself to Philip, an act that Philip took as proof of guilt. Seizing the opportunity, Philip II proceeded to confiscate almost all of John's lands in France, a devastating blow to the Angevin Empire. By the end of 1204, King John had lost Normandy, Anjou, and other territories, largely because Arthur's disappearance undermined support for John among his French vassals. In this way, Arthur's death had profound political consequences. It rallied opposition against John and contributed to the collapse of his French domain. The mystery of Arthur's fate, therefore, isn't just a footnote. It helped reshape medieval geopolitics and helped cement King John as one of the worst English monarchs ever. Okay, so what if I told you that the New England in the States wasn't the first attempt at the concept of a New England? In 1066, the Norman conquest of England upended the Anglo-Saxon ruling class and potentially inadvertently created the first New England in Eastern Europe in the 11th century. In the wake of the conquest, William the Conqueror replaced almost the entire Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman lords. In the wake of this upheaval, some Anglo-Saxons chose to stay and resist Norman rule through rebellions, while others sought refuge abroad. Contemporary accounts indicate that many of these battle-hardened refugees ended up in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors. This Varangian Guard was the Byzantine emperor's corps of foreign elite soldiers, traditionally composed of Norsemen. However, by the late 11th century, it included a substantial number of English exiles. Amid the flow of English emigrants to Byzantium arose a curious medieval legend that a group of Anglo-Saxon refugees founded a new homeland in Eastern Europe. They're said to have founded a realm called New England, or Nova Anglia in Latin. The story survives in two medieval sources. The first is the Chronicon Universale Anonymi Laudunensis, a Latin chronicle written by an English monk in France, around the early 13th century. The second is an Icelandic saga about King Edward the Confessor, known as the Jotvarðar Saga, compiled in the 14th century, but likely based on earlier oral or written material. Both sources tell essentially the same tale. After the Norman conquest, a large band of English exiles ventured across the seas and eventually established a new settlement far to the east. Once it became clear by the 1070s that the King of Denmark wouldn't intervene to restore the English throne, a coalition of English nobles decided to leave their homeland. The saga says they assembled a fleet of 350 ships carrying a great host, including 3 earls and 8 barons, under the leadership of one Siward, Earl of Gloucester. This intrepid Anglo-Saxon fleet sailed out of the North Sea and into history. They passed by the coasts of France and Iberia and entered the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. On their journey, the English exiles proved their prowess by capturing the North African port of Ceuta, seizing its treasure, and then conquering the Balearic Islands of Majorca and Minorca. These adventurous exploits, while reading almost like an epic, set the stage for their arrival in the Byzantine world. When the fleet reached Byzantine waters, according to the two sources, they learned that Constantinople was besieged and in need of help. The English came to the empire's rescue. They sailed to Constantinople, broke the naval blockade, and helped defeat the besieging army. In gratitude, Emperor Alexios Komnenos offered the English warriors a choice. On the one hand, he invited them to settle in his capital and serve as his personal guard, like other earlier Anglo-Saxon exiles had done. While a number of the exiles accepted this offer, thus bolstering the ranks of the Varangian Guard, the rest, led by Earl Siward, yearned for a territory to rule themselves. They lamented that they had no realm to rule over in their old age, and begged Alexios for land of their own. Alexios responded with an intriguing proposition that these freedom-loving, battle-hardened veterans couldn't help but jump at. He told them of a, quote, land lying north in the sea that had once belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, but had long been overrun by pagan inhabitants. If the English could reconquer this land from its heathen rulers, he would grant it to them to hold as their own fief, free of imperial tax. Empowered by this promise, the Anglo-Saxon refugees set sail from Constantinople, heading across the Black Sea. The saga specifies that the Promised Land lay 6 days and nights' sail across the sea to the east and northeast from Constantinople. This detail intriguingly corresponds to the sailing time from Constantinople to the vicinity of Crimea, hinting that the story may preserve authentic geographical knowledge. Upon reaching the designated region, the northeastern coast of the Black Sea, the English exiles waged a series of successful battles against the local pagan inhabitants. Having conquered the territory, they took possession, and in a poignant nod to their lost homeland, they called it England. They founded towns and fortified places, bestowing on them the names of English cities such as London and York. In establishing this New England, the Anglo-Saxon emigrants also maintained their religious and legal traditions. The story notes that they refused to adopt the local Byzantine church practices and instead sought bishops and clergy from the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, they aligned with Western Christendom in worship, perhaps reflecting their loyalty to the Latin rites they knew. According to the two sources, the English colonists continued to live in English style in this thriving colony. For a long time, historians approached the New England story with caution. The sources are relatively late, written decades or even a century after the supposed events, and parts of the tale seemed exaggerated or romanticized. Indeed, some elements of the saga read like romance rather than sober history, for instance, the detour to seize riches in North Africa and Spain. The timeline is also suspect. The chronicle dates the English arrival in Constantinople to around 1075, but Alexios Komnenos wasn't emperor until 1081. This suggests the tale as recorded isn't perfectly aligned with actual chronology, though such minor inaccuracies don't necessarily disprove a thing. Despite these issues, researchers have uncovered a surprising amount of corroborating evidence that an Anglo-Saxon exile community did settle around the Black Sea. It's universally accepted that substantial numbers of Anglo-Saxons went to Constantinople after 1066 to join the Varangian Guard. These elite fighting men would eventually need land and families of their own. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, Byzantine records and Western observers alike note the prominence of English guardsmen in Constantinople. For example, the Varangian Guard, defending the city in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade, included many Englishmen who had resided in the city for generations. This broader context makes the idea of an English military colony abroad plausible. The specific location of New England, described in the legend, somewhere around the Crimean Peninsula and Sea of Azov, is also interesting. Importantly, it matches areas where the Byzantine Empire was indeed active in the late 11th century, and where they were attempting to reassert authority. If a contingent of loyal Anglo-Saxon troops was available, settling them as frontier guardians in a recently recaptured land would make strategic sense. Intriguingly, medieval maps and portolan charts provide tantalizing clues. Starting in the 14th century, Genoese and Catalan navigators mapping the Black Sea coast recorded place names that sound eerily English. One recurring name is Susaco, or Porto di Susaco, on the northeastern Black Sea coast. Scholars interpret Susaco as derived from Saxon, or possibly even from Sussex, which is itself short for South Saxons. To the northwest of Susaco, some charts show a place called Londina, which appears to preserve the name London. These names strongly recall the legend's claim that the exiles named their settlements after English towns. The fact that Londina is often noted next to a river on those maps fits the pattern of English place names, transferring to local geography. It's hard to imagine such specific English names cropping up in Crimea by pure coincidence. They strongly suggest an English presence lingered in that region. Beyond place names, there are reports of an English population around the Black Sea in medieval times. Perhaps the most striking account comes from the mid-13th century, when the Mongol Empire was expanding westward. In 1247, Pope Innocent IV sent Franciscan envoys on an arduous journey to the Great Khan. These friars, traveling through the Black Sea steppe, recorded encountering a people they called the Saxi, Latin for Saxons, living in fortified cities in the Crimean region. Importantly, the envoys note that these Saxi were Christians, though it appears they may have strayed from their traditional Roman Catholic creed by that time. The description aligns with what we might expect of descendants of Anglo-Saxon Christians transplanted to a predominantly non-Christian region. The friars even learned that the Mongols had attempted to besiege one of the Saxi cities, and that they were able to rebuff them. These remarkable reports suggests that a community of people identified as Saxons was not only present, but militarily formidable in Crimea as late as the mid-13th century. To put this in context, this is almost 200 years after the Norman conquest. Given such evidence, many historians have embraced the essential historicity of the New England colony in recent years. While they note that while the medieval narratives may embellish details, the core idea of an Anglo-Saxon community in the Black Sea region aligns with existing evidence. Ultimately, the fate of this community remains very much an open historical question, especially now that the historicity of the community has been largely established. The most common theory is that they may have eventually assimilated into the Crimean Gothic community, a remnant of the Germanic Goths who lived in the region. Others have speculated that they were either wiped out or assimilated by the Golden Horde, or perhaps the Crimean Tatars. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary mysteries. Also, be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. Gilles de Rais was born around 1404 into one of Brittany's wealthiest noble families. By inheritance, he became Baron of Retz, one of the oldest baronies in Brittany, and amassed extensive estates across Brittany, Anjou, Poitou, and other regions. This had the effect of making him one of the most important lords in western France. As a young man, he gained renown during the 100 Years' War, fighting alongside Joan of Arc in major battles. In 1429, after helping lift the English siege of Orléans and participating in numerous victories, Gilles was appointed Marshal of France, the nation's highest military rank. His courage and battlefield prowess earned him great prestige, and he sat among King Charles VII's circle of trusted commanders. Off the battlefield, Gilles de Rais was extravagantly wealthy and lived as a grand seigneur. He maintained a large retinue of soldiers and servants, spent lavishly on art, music, and religious works, and even staged an enormous theatrical spectacle in Orléans to celebrate the war victories. His estates were among the richest in France, but his spending was so reckless that he began to deplete his fortune. He sold off portions of his family lands to fund his lifestyle, angering his surviving relatives and causing rifts within his family. Despite these troubles, de Rais remained a respected noble in the early 1430s. He also grew pious, at least outwardly, founding a private chapel called the Chapel of the Holy Innocents in 1433, notably staffed with a choir of youngsters he handpicked himself. This later detail would seem chilling in light of the accusations to come. By 1435, Gilles de Rais had withdrawn from royal service and returned permanently to his lands, ostensibly to focus on his own interests. Unbeknownst to the world at large, horrifying rumors had started to swirl among the peasantry in the countryside. Little ones were disappearing from villages near de Rais castles, never to be seen again. At first, such absences raised little alarm. It was not uncommon for peasants to enter service in a noble's household and lose contact with their families. Some parents likely believed their missing sons had been taken on as pages or servants by the baron. But as the years went on, whispers grew that something far more sinister was afoot. According to later trial testimony, by the late 1430s, people in the area had seen de Rais' servants disposing of the corpses of dozens of youngsters. Still, locals felt powerless to act against so powerful a lord and a man who was widely hailed as a hero of France. Inside Gilles de Rais' palatial halls, dark deeds were indeed taking place if the confessions are to be believed. De Rais had taken to studying alchemy and demon summoning, possibly in desperation to restore his dwindling wealth. He hired an Italian sorcerer, Francesco Prelati, who promised to help him conjure a demon named Baron that could produce gold. The rituals quickly grew grotesque, and at one attempted summoning, Prelati later testified, the demon demanded an offering of body parts, which de Rais happily provided. By his own confession, Gilles de Rais began his disturbed activities sometime in 1432 or 1433, initially for these occult reasons. For the next several years, he and a small circle of trusted servants indulged in a spree of abductions and slayings. The victims were typically local peasant boys, though he sometimes captured local girls as well. They were lured to his castles with promises of food or work, yet when they arrived, these innocents met nightmarish fates. Later estimates of the number of victims vary widely. Gilles de Rais' indictment claimed as many as 140 had been cruelly ended at his hands. Notably, the shocking unraveling of Gilles de Rais' secret life began with a seemingly unrelated incident. In May 1440, de Rais became embroiled in a dispute over one of his castles. The conflict turned violent when Gilles, defying the Duke of Brittany's officers, stormed into a local church and kidnapped a clergyman during Mass. Enraged by this act of sacrilege and rebellion, the Bishop of Nantes launched an investigation into the baron's conduct. It was then, as the church authorities quietly gathered information, that all the darkest rumors about missing children finally came pouring out. Shocked and alarmed, the Duke of Brittany now acted against a man who had once been his trusted vassal. Notably, and something that generally gets lost in modern tellings of this tale, is that the Duke had essentially lost face in a big way. To have a direct vassal of his commit such disgusting acts right under his nose, in essence, stained his reputation as well. In September 1440, ducal troops arrested Gilles de Rais and several of his accomplices. The celebrated war hero was about to face justice for some of the most ghastly crimes in history. Gilles de Rais was put on trial in the city of Nantes in the fall of 1440. Unusually for the time, he faced a dual proceeding, one trial before the ecclesiastical court of the church, and another before a secular court under the Duke of Brittany's authority. The catalogue of charges was grim, but in general they revolved around both the accused slayings and the occult activities. The trial records became so graphic that the judges ordered the worst parts stricken from the official transcript. The surviving records of what occurred is so disgusting and disturbing that I can't even hint at what he was accused of on this platform. At first, Gilles de Rais responded to the proceedings with defiance and denial. He even challenged the court's jurisdiction angrily until a threat of excommunication brought him to heel. Ultimately, on October 21st, 1440, faced with the weight of evidence and the prospect of torture, Gilles de Rais broke down and confessed in open court. Notably, it was the threat of torture that made him confess, not the actual torture itself. He admitted to the judges that he had committed the atrocities as charged, all in the pursuit of occult-based wealth and his own sick hedonism. This shocking confession, combined with the already overwhelming testimony, made the verdict a foregone conclusion. The planned torture of the accused was canceled since he confessed voluntarily, albeit under threat. Within days, the courts pronounced their judgments. On October 25th, the secular court condemned Gilles de Rais to death. In what was perhaps an even more significant move, the church court likewise declared him guilty of slaying 150 innocent young souls and excommunicated him. Two of Gilles's closest aides were also sentenced to die for their part in the affairs. The trial had moved with remarkable swiftness considering the high stature of the accused. It lasted only about a month from start to finish. In that brief span, the illustrious Marshal of France, once a shining star of Joan of Arc's army, had been unmasked as one of the worst people in history. The conviction rested not only on Gilles' own confession, but on a multitude of eyewitness accounts and material evidence collected from his castles. Modern historians note that the robustness of the case against de Rais left little room for doubt at the time. The sentence was carried out on October 26, 1440, on a river island just outside Nantes. Gilles de Rais, age 35, was to be hanged and then burned, a common execution for those convicted of the most heinous crimes and heresy. He was to be finished off alongside his two chief accomplices. Contemporary accounts say that Gilles de Rais approached his execution with dignity and remorse. He addressed the gathered crowd, expressing contrition for his sins, and urged his partners in crime to pray for their own personal forgiveness for what they had all done. At mid-morning, Gilles was hanged until dead, and his body, suspended above a pyre, was then lowered into the flames. Thus ended the life of Gilles de Rais, in infamy and fire, damned forever for his disgusting and depraved conduct. In the centuries since 1440, the case of Gilles de Rais has remained a subject of both morbid fascination and debate. Early on, many simply accepted the verdict at face value. Over time, however, some historians began to question whether Gilles de Rais was truly the monster the 1440 trial had depicted. Skepticism about the case arose as early as the Enlightenment. Voltaire commented that the occult and witchcraft portion of the trial necessarily cast doubt on the conclusions reached in said trial, and this hesitation planted the seed of doubt for future historians. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a few writers openly argued that de Rais had been wrongfully condemned. These early revisionists wondered if the sensational charges were trumped up by the Church or the Duke of Brittany, who stood to gain from de Rais' downfall. Or at least, that was the revisionist history theory at the time, and we'll get to that in a moment. One theory suggests that the Duke of Brittany coveted Gilles de Rais' lands and wealth. According to these historians, after the trial, the Duke acquired many of the Baron's forfeited estates. Could the Duke and the Bishop of Nantes have conspired to destroy a troublesome vassal and split his riches? Another point raised is the involvement of the Inquisition. One of de Rais' judges was an inquisitor, leading some to claim he was just another victim of witch hunt hysteria. However, according to most experts, an inquisitor being a judge in a church court in the medieval era isn't quite the rarity that some revisionist historians make it out to be. As strongly hinted at, mainstream historians find these revisionist theories unlikely. For one, most of Gilles de Rais' properties ultimately ended up with his family, and the Duke of Brittany had been a long-time protector of Gilles until compelling evidence forced his hand. Further, the humiliation wrought upon the Duke by the activities of his vassals simply can't be understated. This wasn't a one-time act. The Duke had let one of his vassals act in the most deranged manner possible for a period of up to 8 years, reflecting extremely poorly upon him. Further, the Church didn't receive anything directly from the act, and Gilles de Rais had in fact been a significant benefactor of the Church prior to the accusations. Any plot to falsely accuse de Rais would have required dozens of people, all of whom were in on it. Given the era's rudimentary coordination, such an enormous fraud would have been difficult to stage. Modern scholars also point out that by 1440, there really was an abundance of testimony about the missing children. The initial witness statements about peasant boys vanishing weren't a rumor, and there's evidence that reports were made. This stands in stark contrast to a case like Elizabeth Bathory, where despite similar accounts, there's no evidence of any actual missing people. Simply put, something real and terrible was happening, even if the precise details are tangled with medieval fears of demonic cults. Interestingly, Gilles de Rais wasn't defiant to the end by any means, and this wasn't a man who lacked personal courage or heroism. He was indeed believed to be one of the most heroic people of his era, before his true nature was known. If such an individual had been falsely accused, it's often speculated that his numerous friends and relations would have come to his rescue. However, the fact that they didn't has led many to believe that these individuals may have harbored significant suspicions about his character. Perhaps they saw him committing acts on campaign that went beyond the standard brutality of medieval warfare. At present, most historians conclude that Gilles de Rais was in fact the monster he was claimed to be, and his name will forever be associated with some of the worst individual acts in history. On the morning of July 26, 1184, the bustling town of Erfurt in central Germany hosted a gathering of high nobles that would soon go horribly and disgustingly wrong. No one could have predicted that this day would end with roughly 60 nobles being drowned in a slurry of noxious human waste. Whether this event was truly an accident, or whether this was the equivalent of a real-life red wedding with a thick coat of brown paint, remains up for debate. The Holy Roman Empire of the 12th century was rife with local feuds that threatened the realm's stability. One such conflict pitted Ludwig III, the Landgrave of Thuringia, against Conrad, the Archbishop of Mainz, in a bitter struggle over lands and authority. Erfurt itself was under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Mainz, and Ludwig aimed to challenge that control for his own gain. Their rivalry grew so heated that the young King Henry VI, at that time ruling Germany under his father Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, decided imperial intervention was necessary. Henry, eager to be seen as a strong and capable monarch, took on the mediator's role with zeal, keen to secure peace and uphold royal authority in his domains. Henry VI accordingly convened an informal royal assembly in Erfurt to bring the feuding parties together and resolve their differences. He summoned dozens of nobles, bishops, and high-ranking officials from across the empire to attend a council in late July 1184. The gathering was held in a hall within Erfurt's cathedral, and by the morning of July 26th, this hall's upper floor was packed shoulder to shoulder with important people. Most important amongst the guests included King Henry himself, Archbishop Conrad, Landgrave Ludwig, as well as numerous lesser lords and advisors. As discussions got underway that morning, the crowded assembly of nobles strained the aging upper chamber. The sheer weight of so many men put tremendous stress on the timber floor supports. According to contemporary chroniclers, without warning, those wooden beams, long weakened by years of use and neglect, suddenly gave way with a deafening crack. The upper floor collapsed and crashed down onto the level below, which in turn also failed under the impact. In an instant, the entire meeting, people, furniture, and flooring, plunged through the structure and into an enormous cesspit beneath the hall. Knights in armor, wooden tables and benches, and splintered beams all hurtled into the vile pit as the building disintegrated around them. In the chaotic moments that followed, those who fell met an appalling fate. They found themselves floundering in years of accumulated foul waste, a mix of excrement and groundwater, which had a thick, quicksand-like consistency that made escape nearly impossible. Luckier victims were crushed by falling timbers and furnishings. Those who weren't as fortunate drowned in the muck or succumbed to the poisonous miasma of the noxious fumes. The cesspit's contents were also rife with disease and parasites, adding another lethal element to the disaster. Contemporary reports indicate that roughly 60 men died then and there, and some accounts suggest the death toll may have reached closer to 100 in total. Among the dead were a number of prominent nobles. However, miraculously, or perhaps suspiciously, all the key members in attendance escaped with their lives. Interestingly, two of the most prominent individuals were completely unharmed. King Henry VI himself escaped the plunge entirely. He and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz had been sitting on a stone-reinforced window alcove when the floor fell, and they managed to cling to it as the chamber collapsed around them. Rescuers with ladders eventually pulled the king and the archbishop to safety, and while they were both shaken, and perhaps stirred, they were essentially unharmed. Landgrave Ludwig III, who had tumbled down with the rest of the crowd, also survived and was hauled out of the cesspit alive. For King Henry, there was little time to dwell on the horrific accident. Chronicles report that he departed Erfurt almost immediately afterward and resumed a military campaign he had been on, effectively abandoning the unresolved dispute between the lords. In essence, the mediation abruptly ended, and the long-standing conflict between the Landgrave and the Archbishop remained unsettled. Notably, medieval writers recorded the event only in brief entries. The king, having nearly met a truly disgusting end, had little desire to memorialize such a fiasco, and the Erfurt tragedy remained a relatively obscure footnote in imperial history. Yet the Erfurt latrine disaster's true significance lies in what didn't happen. Had Henry VI himself perished in that cesspit, the future of the empire, and indeed of European history, might have veered onto a very different path. Henry's survival ensured that he went on to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, and eventually one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He led imperial armies on crusade, he captured and ransomed England's king Richard the Lionheart, and extended his dominion deep into southern Italy and Sicily. None of those momentous events would have come to pass if an overloaded floor in Erfurt had claimed the king's life that day. People have long questioned how such a bizarre catastrophe could have occurred in the first place. The simplest explanation is also the most plausible. An overcrowded hall and structural decay combined to cause a deadly failure. The wooden floor's supports were reportedly rotten, and the sheer weight of nearly 100 assembled men, many of them semi-armored nobles, was more than the old timbers could bear. The citadel's latrine below was especially large and had seldom been emptied, so it contained a vast quantity of sewage at the time. That said, there's a much more sinister theory about why this happened. The primary reason for the meeting in Erfurt was to mediate a bitter feud between two powerful men, Ludwig III, Landgrave of Thuringia, and Conrad of Wittelsbach, Archbishop of Mainz. Both were influential, ambitious, and had powerful rivals who might have found it advantageous if either or both were eliminated. Ludwig III, as Landgrave of Thuringia, was deeply involved in territorial disputes that had drawn hostility from various nobles in central Germany. His aggressive pursuit of power, coupled with his refusal to acknowledge the authority of Archbishop Conrad, placed him squarely at odds with powerful church authorities. Conrad of Mainz, for his part, wielded immense influence not only in religious matters, but in secular governance as well. It's conceivable that rival factions could have sought a permanent solution to the persistent instability caused by Ludwig and Conrad's feud. A tragedy that seemed like an accident would be a perfect cover: plausible deniability, limited risk of exposure, and minimal direct reprisals. In essence, the Erfurt latrine disaster may have been the medieval equivalent of taking down a passenger plane just to eliminate one target. Another intriguing angle involves King Henry VI himself. It's important to remember that during the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire was an extremely powerful player in European politics, and not the decrepit entity it would develop into. At only 18, Henry was heir apparent to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and his future influence over European politics was already significant. His demise would have sent shockwaves throughout Europe, reshuffling political alliances and possibly setting off a struggle for succession that many ambitious nobles might find advantageous. Henry's father had no shortage of enemies within the empire. Many princes felt oppressed by imperial centralization efforts and would have welcomed a weakened monarchy. Removing Henry would destabilize Barbarossa's carefully planned succession, potentially freeing them from central control. If the collapse was indeed deliberate sabotage, the method, rotted or weakened floor beams, was subtle enough to appear natural, yet devastating enough to achieve maximum lethality. Whoever orchestrated this would have needed inside access to the building beforehand, a plausible scenario considering the numerous local servants and retainers employed by nobles. This method would require no elaborate weapons or obvious tampering, just deliberate weakening of the timbers, so a full haul would result in a disaster. For conspirators, the horrific randomness could be beneficial. The tragedy's broad carnage might obscure motives, eliminating suspicion on who was targeted. After all, the event had numerous high-profile attendees who had enemies who wanted them eliminated. Interestingly, many find it quite odd that Henry and the Archbishop were sitting in a stone alcove at the precise moment of the fall, while the Landgrave fell into the pit. It's been suggested that Henry and the Archbishop may have been plotting together to increase the power of the Church in the region. The thought is that this may have been in exchange for papal support of Emperor Barbarossa's attempt to turn the Holy Roman Empire into a hereditary monarchy. If this was the case, the plot failed, and Henry beat a hasty retreat, and chroniclers kept their discussions of this event to a bare minimum. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg saw one of history's strangest epidemics, a dancing plague in which dozens of people danced compulsively in the streets for weeks on end. Contemporary reports describe the sufferers flailing their arms and convulsing uncontrollably, faces dripping with sweat and feet bleeding through their shoes. These weren't joyous revelers, but ordinary citizens seized by a mysterious compulsion, and some danced themselves to exhaustion or even death as crowds watched in disbelief. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa suddenly stepped into a Strasbourg street and began dancing without rest, as if entranced. Within days, dozens of others had joined her, caught up in the same unexplainable urge to dance. The dancing epidemic spread to as many as 400 people, all swaying and twirling in a trance-like state. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some reportedly suffered fatal strokes or heart attacks as the marathon dancing went on and on. The strange episode persisted into September, shocking the city's authorities and baffling all who witnessed it. Strasbourg's city leaders were alarmed by this bizarre plague and struggled to find a remedy. At first, they consulted the town's physicians, who declared the dance to be a natural illness caused by overheated blood. Under the medieval humoral understanding of medicine, an excess of hot blood needed to be expelled from the body. Following this advice, the authorities encouraged the afflicted to continue dancing the sickness out. The idea was that if the sufferers danced continuously, the fever of the dance would burn itself out. This well-intentioned cure, however, backfired horribly. The sight of dozens of people dancing madly in public only fueled the town's superstition. Many onlookers believed the dancers were victims of St. Vitus's curse, a divine punishment forcing sinners to dance, and they feared that they could be next. In the fervor, even more people joined in the compulsive dance, swept up by what we might now call crowd psychology. One later chronicle claimed that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people a day were dying from strokes, heart failure, or exhaustion, and the city authorities realized their mistake. Instead of encouraging dancing, they now banned all forms of shimmying and shaking in Strasbourg. Finally, in late August, officials gathered the remaining afflicted dancers, loaded them into wagons, and sent them to a shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby mountains. According to reports, priests at the shrine performed a special ritual to cure the dancers. The exhausted men and women were given small crosses to hold and made to wear red shoes painted with holy crosses on the soles. They were led around a wooden effigy of St. Vitus, while priests chanted prayers and sprinkled holy water and consecrated oil. This act of devotion, combined with the distance from the public eye, seemed to break whatever spell had gripped them. Word soon spread that St. Vitus had forgiven the sufferers, and the dance mania gradually subsided. By early September 1518, the plague had finally run its course, and the city fell quiet, left to wonder what exactly had just happened. For all the relief at its end, one question remained. What caused this bizarre outbreak? Despite becoming the most well-known dancing mania, the 1518 incident was far from an isolated case. In fact, outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing had occurred in Europe before, especially in the Rhine River region. A particularly large eruption in 1374 saw people in dozens of towns convulsing in dance until they collapsed. However, there are documented cases going back to the 10th and 11th centuries in what is now Germany and Italy. Yet the Strasbourg episode of 1518 was the last and best documented of these strange events, and even in its own time, people struggled to explain it. Contemporary observers offered both supernatural and natural theories. Many among the pious believed it was the work of divine wrath or demonic possession. The curse of St. Vitus was a primary suspect, which is why so many victims and their families turned to prayer and saintly intercession. Meanwhile, doctors and city officials dismissed otherworldly causes and blamed physical or psychological ones, such as an excess of hot blood overwhelming the brain. The famed physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg a few years later, even put forward an eccentric theory that the plague began as a kind of ruse. He claimed Frau Trophea had feigned her affliction to embarrass her husband, and that other women began dancing to thumb their noses at their own husbands. While his explanation now seems absurd, and was likely even then a minority view, it at least shifted the blame from angry saints and demons toward human psychology. In truth, no consensus existed at the time. The people of 1518 were grasping for answers to an event that must have felt as inexplicable as it was terrifying. In modern times, historians and scientists have continued to puzzle over the dancing plague of 1518. Several hypotheses have been proposed, but only one has gained broad acceptance. One suggestion is food poisoning, the idea that villagers might have consumed bread made from rye tainted with ergot, a fungus that can produce hallucinations and convulsions. Notably, this theory was once widely accepted by academics as the likely cause of the event. However, this theory is now largely discounted since ergot poisoning renders individuals bedridden after an initial burst of energy. This, of course, doesn't fit with people dancing for months on end. Another theory claims that the dancers were members of a heretical religious sect or cult engaging in ecstatic ritual. However, there's no direct evidence for any secret cult involvement, and this idea remains speculative and not widely supported by historians. The most widely accepted explanation for the 1518 dancing plague is that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. Essentially, it was a mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and pervasive fear. Strasbourg in 1518 was a community under enormous strain. The region had been struck by a series of bad harvests and famine, and was stalked by diseases like smallpox and the recently arrived syphilis. Facing hunger and illness, people also shared a deep-seated cultural superstition, a belief that Saint Vitus could punish sinners by making them dance uncontrollably. In a state of heightened anxiety, one person's spontaneous dancing could unconsciously set off a chain reaction. Modern psychologists now accept that in certain contexts, groups of people can exhibit physical symptoms with no obvious physical cause. In 1518, the citizens of Strasbourg arguably experienced just such a phenomenon. The first dancer, Frau Trophea, might have been the spark, and the city's collective stress and belief in the curse of St. Vitus was the tinder. As the fear spread, dozens of others essentially tranced themselves into the same hysterical dance. The fact that the sufferers truly couldn't control their movements, yet later recovered, aligns with what we now understand about psychosomatic disorders fueled by stress and expectation. In other words, the dancing plague was likely a massive stress-induced psychosis that spread by example and suggestion through an anxious community. That said, while this hypothesis has gained widespread acceptance, it hasn't yet been definitively proven. In fact, over the centuries, a number of proposed causes have reached consensus-level understanding, only to go out of fashion. If you asked an educated person 500 years ago, they would have almost certainly talked about overheated blood. Fast forward to 50 years ago, and the modern-day equivalents were talking about rye bread and ergot. Now here we are in the present day, and mass psychogenic illness is the present consensus amongst scholars. Perhaps in another 50 years, it'll be something different entirely. On a cold November evening in 1643, with the thunder of cannon fire shaking the walls of Rottweil, hundreds of frightened townspeople gathered inside the Dominican church. Clutching their rosaries, they prayed desperately for deliverance from the siege outside. According to numerous accounts, their prayers were answered in a most startling way. The statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar seemed to come alive. Witnesses said Mary's face shifted in color, and her eyes moved, gazing upward and then back down toward the beleaguered city. Some believed they heard her voice in the hushed church. This 1643 incident, later known as Our Lady of the Turning Eyes, would become one of the most famous miracles of the 30 Years' War. In the autumn of 1643, the walled city of Rottweil, a Catholic stronghold in the Holy Roman Empire, was battered by a siege in the last decade of the 30 Years' War. The French had fully encircled the city, cutting off supplies while the walls of the city withstood bombardment. The situation grew desperate as bombardments breached sections of the aging medieval walls by mid-November. Inside Rottweil, Fear and turmoil reigned, and the exhausted defenders argued over whether to hold out or surrender to the enemy, who promised to spare civilians if the city yielded. It was in this dire atmosphere that an extraordinary event was reported. The Dominican friars, together with hundreds of townspeople, held continuous rosary prayers inside Rottweil's Dominican church. According to eyewitnesses, on November 10th, 1643, the statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar suddenly changed. The Madonna's face appeared to turn pale, and her carved eyes came to life and moved, shifting upward toward heaven, then downward toward the congregation and the city. Some present even claimed they heard a soft sigh or word from the statue. Both Catholics and a few skeptical Protestants who had taken refuge in the church witnessed this uncanny occurrence. Stunned worshippers were reportedly moved to tears and awe at the sight. News of the miracle of the turning eyes spread through the city in the following days. Many believers interpreted Mary's movements as a direct response to their fervent prayers, as if the Virgin were acknowledging their pleas and interceding with her Son for Rottweil's safety. This helped the besieged Rottweilers' morale immensely, and all talks of giving up the city ceased. On November 25th, 1643, about 2 weeks after the first incident, a second phenomenon was reported. Witnesses saw the statue's face, formerly so pale, suddenly become flush with color, as if the statue had once again come to life. Once again her eyes seemed to shift their gaze, and a few tears were seen glistening on her cheeks. That same night, miles away at Tuttlingen, a relief army of Bavarian, Spanish, and Imperial forces launched a surprise attack on the French camp. The enemy was completely routed in the Battle of Tuttlingen, and the siege of Rottweil was abruptly lifted. To the faithful, the timing was no coincidence. Clearly, the intercession of the Virgin Mary had saved the city. The reported miracle at Rottweil reverberated throughout Catholic Europe. In 1643, the war's 25th year, Catholics saw this event as a powerful sign of divine favor amid chaos. The occurrence came during the Counter-Reformation's peak of Marian devotion, when Mary was often invoked as a heavenly protectress in battle. To the faithful, the Virgin's intervention at Rottweil seemed to confirm that heaven was on their side. Catholic preachers and writers pointed to the episode as proof of their true faith's power, encouraging the devout to persevere. According to contemporary accounts, some Protestants who witnessed the event were reported to have been so moved by the occurrence that they converted to Catholicism. Given the dozens of eyewitness accounts and the rapid spread of the story in print, church authorities took the claims of 1643 very seriously. A formal inquiry gathered the testimony of 42 eyewitnesses, and on March 14th, 1644, the church officially confirmed the miracle as worthy of belief. That same year, a printed report of the event circulated in Catholic regions, spreading Rottweil's fame. The church soon became a site of pilgrimage, with many visitors coming to venerate the miraculous image, with some even claiming cures or other favors in Mary's name. There are three common explanations for what happened at Rottweil. The traditional Catholic interpretation views this incident as a genuine miracle. According to this theory, the Virgin Mary, moved by the fervent prayers of the besieged residents, visibly turned her eyes as a sign of compassion, reassurance, and divine protection. Supporters point to the precise timing of the second event, which occurred just before Rottweil was miraculously relieved in the Battle of Tuttlingen. For centuries, this has remained the dominant explanation among believers, solidifying Rottweil's Marian devotion and confirming for many the legitimacy of their Catholic faith. A popular skeptical modern theory suggests that the incident resulted from a psychological phenomenon, specifically mass hysteria or collective delusion induced by extreme stress. In 1643, the residents of Rottweil were under intense psychological strain due to prolonged siege warfare, fear, hunger, and uncertainty. Under these conditions, suggestible individuals may have interpreted subtle visual cues, such as flickering candlelight, shadows, or reflections, as movements of the statue's eyes. According to this view, as news of the event spread, confirmation bias and peer pressure likely reinforced eyewitness accounts, solidifying the event's perceived miraculous nature. Another modern explanation proposes that the phenomenon was the result of a natural optical illusion. The apparent shifting eyes and changes in facial coloration could have been due to shifting light conditions from candles, torches, and reflective surfaces within the church. Wooden statues, painted and varnished, can appear to move subtly depending on the angle of illumination and viewer perspective, particularly under flickering candlelight. Small environmental factors like humidity, temperature changes, or minor movements of the statue's supporting structure may also have contributed to the illusion. According to this explanation, this may have convinced observers that they had witnessed a miraculous event. Whatever the case, what's clear is that the first sighting calmed the nerves of the people of Rottweil. The second sighting, 2 weeks later, and coinciding with the break of the siege, appeared to confirm that this event had led to the deliverance of the town. Imagine living in a time when money itself seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. In the mid-15th century, Europe experienced a severe shortage of precious metals so extreme that historians call it the Great Bullion Famine. Coins were the lifeblood of the medieval economy and were the basis for both trade and taxes. And unlike today, when central banks can simply print fiat currency, medieval governments had no such option. When the silver and gold ran out, so did the money supply. As these resources grew scarce, markets faltered, wages went unpaid in real currency, and everyone from merchants to kings found their treasuries running dry. The bullion famine was the result of a perfect storm of economic imbalance, geopolitical turmoil, and technological limits. One major factor was Europe's trade deficit with the Eastern world. Late medieval Europeans had a voracious appetite for spices, silk, and other luxuries from the Middle East and Asia. To pay for these imports, Western merchants sent huge quantities of silver coin eastward. Over time, bullion flowed out of Europe faster than it came in. This might have been sustainable if European mines could ramp up production to replace the lost silver and gold, but by the 1400s, many of those mines were in decline. Easily accessible veins were exhausted, and miners struggled to dig deeper with the era's limited technology. The famous silver mines of Bohemia, for example, produced only a fraction of their former output by the 15th century. Plague, various conflicts, and loss of territory to outside powers compounded the problem. The Black Plague in the 14th century had devastated Europe's population, including the mining workforce. Then ongoing conflicts, like the 100 Years' War in Western Europe and conflicts in the Balkans, disrupted trade and drained treasuries. In the East, the expanding Ottoman Empire seized control of rich Balkan silver mines, cutting off a source that once fed European mints. Even the stream of gold from West Africa, once brought into Europe via trans-Saharan trade routes, had dwindled by the 15th century, removing another traditional source of bullion. By the 1450s, Europe was at the height of the squeeze. More silver was leaving than could be replaced, and gold was equally scarce. People at the time grasped for explanations. Many blamed hoarding. the idea that merchants were hiding away coins and not spending them. Indeed, uncertainty may have led some to stuff their coffers, but hoarding was only a minor piece of the puzzle. The real roots of the crisis lay in those bigger forces, a continent spending its money abroad while its mines ran dry amid plague and conflict. The bullion famine had dramatic consequences for trade, labor, and governance. Commerce slowed to a crawl due to this lack of cash. Without enough silver and gold currency in circulation, buying and selling became difficult, and more transactions resorted to inefficient barter systems. The crisis also hit the workforce. Employers found it hard to pay wages in real money, and workers grew frustrated receiving pay in kind, such as food or cloth. In England, it became so bad that in 1464, King Edward IV decreed cloth workers must be paid in, quote, true and lawful money, rather than in goods. Even so, complaints continued, since often there was simply no silver available to pay artisans and laborers. Many people effectively fell back into a barter economy for daily life. Governments struggled to function as their treasuries thinned. Kingdoms needed coins to pay soldiers, equip ships, and administer justice. As bullion dried up, mints from England to Florence slowed or halted production. Some rulers resorted to debasement, the process of mixing less precious metal into coins to stretch the supply. This tactic allowed more coins to be minted from the same bullion, but it led to inflation and public distrust, since each coin contained less precious metal. By the mid-15th century, much of Europe was mired in an economic slump, and social unrest flared as communities struggled under the strain. Still, a few financial hubs weathered the storm better than others. For example, the trading cities of the Low Countries used sophisticated credit networks and alternative currencies to keep commerce moving, even when silver was scarce. Solving the bullion famine took effort, innovation, and global exploration. One remedy was to boost mining output at home. The urgent need for metal drove technical progress in European mining. By the mid-1400s, miners had introduced new pumps and equipment to dig deeper into exhausted mines. This led to fresh discoveries or better yields in Central Europe, where rich silver veins were tapped in the 1450s and beyond. Those new mines didn't flood the market overnight, but they gradually increased Europe's coin supply and eased the worst shortages. Another remedy was to find bullion abroad. Portugal's explorers played a key role here. Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast in the 15th century seeking gold. By the 1440s, they began bringing back African gold from trading posts on the Guinea coast. This African gold was a lifeline, allowing mints to strike more coins and keep commerce alive. Further, in 1498, Vasco da Gama's expedition opened a sea route to India. This gave Europeans direct access to Asian markets and reduced the need to pay for Eastern goods with Europe's remaining silver by cutting out most of the people in the middle. The most dramatic turning point came with the Age of Discovery. The search for precious metals, amongst other goods, drove explorers like Christopher Columbus to venture across the Atlantic. Columbus's 1492 voyage, though intended to find Asia, led to the European encounter with the Americas. Within a few decades, the Spanish were sending shiploads of treasure back home. By the 1530s, silver from rich mines in the Americas was pouring into Europe. This flood of new wealth decisively ended the bullion famine. By the mid-16th century, Europe had a far more plentiful money supply than before, marking the transition to a new economic era. Ironically, Europe then faced yet another problem: bullion-fueled inflation in the 1500s. This crisis left a lasting mark on how Europeans handled money and trade. The scarcity of coin forced people to innovate with credit and banking, helping plant some of the early seeds of capitalism. With not enough metal money to go around, merchants and financiers had to rely more on letters of credit, bills of exchange, and other forms of paper promise. Italian banking houses in places like Florence and Venice were at the forefront of this financial adaptation. They developed sophisticated accounting systems to keep track of transactions without immediate cash, effectively creating money on the books. This wider use of credit and trust helped keep commerce afloat and demonstrated the power of banking networks. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Behind every delicate gesture of Japan's iconic tea ceremony lies a hidden story most people never hear. This is a tale of powerful aristocrats, fierce samurai, power struggles, Zen masters defying luxury, and even mysterious deaths. It's time for you to discover how a simple cup of tea became the soul of Japanese high culture. Tea first arrived in Japan from China during the Heian period, running from 794 to 1185 AD. The earliest record of tea in Japan dates to the early 9th century, when Buddhist monks who had studied in Tang Dynasty China brought back tea leaves and knowledge of its preparation. At that time, tea was consumed in the form called dancha, or brick tea. The leaves were compressed into bricks, shaved into boiling water, and often mixed with a variety of spices as a sort of tonic. This brew was prized for its stimulating medicinal qualities, and eager Heian aristocrats initially embraced it as part of a broader fascination with Chinese culture. However, as Japan's missions to China ceased with the Tang dynasty's decline, the court's enthusiasm for tea faded. The fashion of tea drinking waned among nobles, surviving mainly within Buddhist monasteries that quietly preserved the practice through the late Heian era. A new chapter began in the Kamakura period running from 1185 to 1333. During this period, Japan was introduced to powdered green tea, matcha, from China. This period also saw the rise of Zen Buddhism, which would become one of the most significant influences on the development of the Japanese tea ceremony. The monk Eisai, who founded Japan's Rinzai Zen school, returned from study in Song China with tea seeds and the custom of preparing powdered tea. In China's monasteries, tea was used in rituals and to sustain meditation, and Eisai eagerly promoted tea in Japan as a means to health and spiritual benefit. He planted tea bushes on temple lands and extolled the drink's virtues in his 1211 treatise Kisa Yojoki, generally translated as drinking tea for health. Eisai even presented tea to Shogun Minamoto Sanetomo, reportedly curing the ruler's ailment and convincing the samurai elite of tea's merits. Backed by the patronage of warriors and clergy, tea cultivation spread. By the 14th century, it was grown widely beyond the old capitals. What had been an exclusive luxury became more accessible, though it remained a marker of refinement and status. As tea drinking gained a foothold among the warrior class, it developed into new social forms. In the Muromachi period, from 1336 to 1573, Japan's Ashikaga shoguns championed an elegant tea and art culture influenced by Chinese models. Shoguns like Ashikaga Yoshimasa amassed collections of Chinese paintings, ceramics, and utensils to use in lavish tea gatherings. Specialized rooms were built to display these treasures during tea service, and attendants handled the preparation while lords and guests admired imported tea bowls and cups. Tea drinking became a grand form of entertainment and connoisseurship. A popular pastime called tocha, tea guessing, emerged, in which participants would drink multiple bowls of tea and compete to identify the origin of the leaves. Records from the 14th century describe huge tea contests, where 100 bowls might be tasted, and winners received prizes like bags of gold dust. While this aristocratic tea culture celebrated luxury, a quieter current was also emerging that would subvert all the traditional elements of the tea ceremony cultivated by the aristocratic class. By the 15th century, the aesthetics of tea were shifting towards simplicity and spirituality, guided by Zen ideals. Murata Juko is credited as the originator of the wabi-cha style of tea ceremony. Around 1486, he established a new kind of tea gathering that rejected the showy formalism of the shogunate's banquets. His ideal was a rustic, tranquil tea ceremony grounded in the appreciation of natural simplicity and imperfection. Murata Juko taught that tea was not merely about enjoying a drink, but was a discipline for purifying the mind and body. In practice, this meant favoring small, austere spaces and humble utensils over opulent halls and imported Chinese wares. The tea ceremony reached its classical form in the late 16th century under Sen no Rikyu, undoubtedly the most revered tea master in Japanese history. He served as tea advisor to Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, two of the unifiers of Japan, and through them Rikyu's influence spread widely. He would have likely served Tokugawa Ieyasu as well, but as you'll see, his philosophy caused significant friction with powerful feudal lords. Rikyu pushed the principles of simplicity to their zenith, insisting on the primacy of down-to-earth sincerity over showiness in the tea room. In the tea huts Rikyu designed, space and light were minimized to focus all the senses on the moment. The entryway to these huts was a small door, which forced all guests regardless of status to crawl through, equalizing everyone in a meditative space. Inside, decoration was sparse, perhaps a single flower in a simple imperfect vase and a hanging scroll of simple Zen poetry, alongside the few utensils needed to make tea. Rikyu often chose humble everyday objects as tea utensils. Even a wooden bucket might serve as a fresh water jar, defying the notion that only fancy imported items were suitable. He also worked with craftsmen to create new implements aligned with the ideals of simplicity. Rikyu worked with master potters to create hand-molded tea bowls called rakuware, with simple shapes and muted glazes, in deliberate contrast to exquisite Chinese ceramics. Despite this focus on simplicity, Hideyoshi, who Rikyu served under, used tea ceremonies to flaunt his power, and delighted in having Kyoto aristocrats equalize themselves before him. In 1587, he hosted a grand open-air tea event in Kyoto for all members of high society, and he even commissioned a portable tea room lavishly covered in gold leaf. Rikyu's ethos emphasized restraint and spiritual depth over ostentation, putting him increasingly at odds with his patron's extravagance. Their relationship ended abruptly in 1591, when Hideyoshi, for reasons unknown, gave Rikyu a weapon and told him his time on Earth had drawn to a close. Despite this abrupt ending, Rikyu's legacy would be picked up through the ensuing Edo period, which ran from 1603 to 1868. The Tokugawa government embraced the tea ceremony as an ideal training in refinement and etiquette for the now essentially decommissioned samurai class. Rather than focusing on fighting, these warriors now read books of poetry and took part in elaborate tea ceremonies. Rikyu's descendants and disciples carried his teachings forward by establishing enduring tea schools. His grandsons Sen Sotan and Sotan's sons founded the three main schools of the tea ceremony, which each claimed direct heritage from Rikyu. Feudal lords also developed their own styles of ceremony, and over time the practice spread beyond the elite. The art of tea, once the realm of monks and Kyoto nobles and high-ranking samurai, gradually became part of bourgeois cultural education by the Meiji era. By that time, It had been seen as an embodiment of Japanese refinement since time immemorial. In the Meiji period, the tea ceremony began to undergo a further cultural shift. While it was initially completely dominated by men, women of the Meiji period ended up picking up the art as a way to preserve a significant part of Japanese culture. As of 2016, when the latest study was conducted on this, 80% of tea ceremony participants are now women. Picture the waterways of medieval Europe teeming with beavers, industrious rodents felling trees and damming streams. The European beaver was once ubiquitous across the continent, from the British Isles through Scandinavia and eastward into Siberia. Yet starting in the medieval period, this fur-laden creature began to disappear from the heart of Europe. For thousands of years, European beavers thrived in rivers, wetlands, and forests across the continent. Archaeological finds and historical records suggest that beavers were an ordinary part of European fauna in ancient times. They were so common that early European cultures incorporated them into folklore and everyday life. However, by the Middle Ages, signs of trouble were emerging for the beaver. Beaver pelts and other products had become valuable commodities, and intensive hunting had begun to whittle down their numbers. By medieval times, beaver populations were severely reduced in most European countries, surviving mainly in remote marshes and other inaccessible places that offered refuge. In other words, centuries ago, the beaver had already disappeared from large swaths of its former range. For example, in the British Isles, the beaver was eliminated remarkably early. Records indicate it was gone from England and Wales by the 13th century and from Scotland by the 16th century. In Portugal, the beaver is believed to have become extinct around 1450, while the creature fared better in Spain, lasting into the 17th century. Similar trends played out across the rest of Western Europe. As human populations and demand for natural resources grew, beavers were harvested in huge and unsustainable numbers. Several factors drove the beaver's early decline, but foremost was the high value of its fur. Beaver fur is dense and water-resistant, ideal for making warm, durable felt. In an era long before synthetic materials, this pelt was a prize for clothing and hat making. As early as the medieval period, European hatters and tailors prized beaver fur for crafting luxurious felt hats, trimming coats, and other garments. This demand only intensified in the following centuries. By the early modern period, a fashionable beaver felt hat was a status symbol among Europe's upper classes. The result was relentless hunting pressure on any beaver population accessible to trappers. By the 1600s, beavers had become so scarce in Western Europe that traders looked abroad to fill Europe's voracious appetite for their pelts. Fortunately for Europeans, but disastrously for the world's beaver population, North America was practically overflowing with beavers. Indeed, much of the exploration and European settlement of North America was spurred by the search for beaver fur, and millions of pelts were shipped to European markets. Simply put, the European beaver's depletion thus had global ripple effects, fueling a transatlantic fur trade and even the settlement of an entire continent. Fur was not the only beaver product Europeans coveted. Another potent incentive for hunting was castoreum, a pungent, oily secretion from glands near the beaver's tail. Castoreum had an almost legendary status in historical medicine and perfumery. Apothecaries from ancient Rome through the Renaissance prized it as a cure-all for various ailments. Dried beaver gland could fetch high prices as an ingredient in treatments for headaches, fever, and even epilepsy. Some medieval and early modern physicians believed castoreum's strong scent had therapeutic properties. While we now know these claims were exaggerated, The belief in castoreum's power meant virtually every beaver had its castor glands removed and sold. Perfumers, too, valued castoreum as a scent ingredient. It was used in luxury fragrances to add leathery or musky notes. Cultural and religious practices also played a role in the beaver's decline. In an unusual twist, the Catholic Church at one point classified beavers as fish for purposes of Lent fasting rules. This originated in the 17th century when French missionaries in Quebec, faced with strict prohibitions on meat during Lent, petitioned the church to allow beaver meat on the menu. A theologian in Paris agreed that because beavers lived in water, they could be treated as fish during Lent. This ruling meant that devout Catholics in some regions could eat beaver flesh on Fridays, or during Lent without breaking religious dietary laws. This practice migrated back from the New World to Europe, giving the green light for Catholics to consume European beavers to their heart's content. The beaver thus became a triple threat, so to speak. It was highly valued for its fur and for its castoreum, and now for religious reasons it wasn't officially meat. While hunting was the primary cause of the beaver's depletion, it was not the only one. The landscape of Europe was changing dramatically from medieval times onward. As agriculture expanded and human settlements grew, wetland habitats were drained and forests cleared, robbing beavers of places to live. Beavers rely on riverside woodlands and marshy areas to build their lodges and dams. The same rivers and fertile floodplains that beavers loved were also prime targets for farmers and town builders. Across Europe, many swamps and beaver wetlands were systematically drained to create arable land or to reduce malaria. This widespread habitat destruction compounded the pressures on beavers. In Italy, for example, historians note that beavers largely disappeared around the start of the 16th century, in part due to habitat alteration as much as hunting. Notably, the European beaver did have holdouts in some parts of the continent. By the early 1600s, Russia and Scandinavia, where beavers still persisted after disappearing from Britain and much of Western Europe, were exporting beaver pelts to the rest of Europe. By the late 19th century, the beaver situation was dire. The process, which had begun during the Middle Ages, was reaching its logical conclusion. After centuries of unregulated trapping, very few beavers remained in the wild. Estimates suggest that by 1900, only about 1,000 European beavers were left alive on the entire continent and across Asia. In Western Europe, these beavers largely found themselves lodging in France and Germany, with the remainder living in the Russian Empire. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, a species that once numbered in the tens of millions had been reduced to a handful of holdouts. Notably, Norway also had a very small population of European beavers, and the Norwegians acted in a forward-thinking way. Rather than attempting to hunt the remainder of their beavers, they granted them full legal protection in 1845. This was one of Europe's first wildlife protection laws, intended solely for the protection of the animal itself. Beyond the cultural and economic aspects, the depletion of the European beaver had profound ecological consequences. Beavers are often called nature's engineers, and their dam building and tree felling activities create and maintain wetlands that support countless other species. When beavers were removed from most of Europe, the landscapes they had shaped for millennia began to unravel in subtle but significant ways. Rivers that once wove through beaver dams and ponds began to flow faster and straighter without those natural barriers, which in turn increased erosion and altered water tables. Seasonal floods, no longer tempered by beaver wetlands, could rush downstream unchecked. Likewise, many wetlands and ponds simply drained away once beavers were gone, since their dams were no longer there to hold water in the floodplain. Over time, areas that had been lush, marshy meadows turned into drier ground, or simplified stream channels. This habitat change meant a loss of biodiversity and countless species that thrive in beaver-formed wetlands lost critical habitat. It's unknown how many species were lost due to the decline of the beaver, though it's speculated that this affected species endemic to the British Isles the most. As of now, the European beaver has been reintroduced throughout the continent, and there are believed to be well over 1 million of them now. This is, of course, far below their historical maximum, but considering they were almost fully extinct a century ago, it's extremely positive progress. Casimir IV was one of the most significant monarchs of the 15th century. As Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1440 and King of Poland from 1447 until his death, he ruled Poland and Lithuania in a personal union for nearly half a century. His reign was marked by important military and political achievements. Under Casimir's leadership, the Kingdom of Poland defeated the Teutonic Knights in the 13 Years' War. This action reclaimed the province of Pomerania and effectively ended the Knights' dominance in Prussia permanently. He also sought to maintain and formalize the union between Poland and Lithuania and worked to reclaim other lands that had once belonged to the Polish crown. Through his marriage to Elizabeth of Habsburg and the strategic marriages of their children, Casimir cemented alliances with powerful dynasties across Europe. In his lifetime, he elevated the already influential Jagiellonian dynasty into one of the leading royal houses of the continent. By the end of his reign, Poland-Lithuania had grown into a major power. Casimir was widely respected as a capable ruler, and his legacy endured long after his passing. However, as it turned out, there would be a much more eerie legacy tied to his final resting place. Casimir IV died on June 7, 1492, and was laid to rest with great honor in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. His tomb, a red marble sarcophagus topped by an ornate sculpted effigy of the king, was a masterpiece crafted by the renowned German sculptor Veit Stoss around the late 1490s. For centuries, this tomb in the Holy Cross Chapel of Wawel Cathedral remained sealed and undisturbed, holding the remains of Casimir IV and his wife Elizabeth. The king's effigy on the sarcophagus lid depicts him in grand regalia. Generations of visitors to Wawel could view the exterior of Casimir's splendid tomb monument, but none had seen inside it since the early 16th century. That would change in the 1970s, when a team of researchers gained permission to open the tomb, unwittingly setting the stage for a modern legend about a king's curse. In the early 1970s, the cathedral undertook restoration work on the Holy Cross Chapel, where Casimir's tomb is located. As part of this project, church authorities made a momentous decision. They granted permission to open Casimir's tomb for the first time in nearly 480 years. In May 1973, Archbishop Karol Wojtyla of Krakow, better known to the world later as Pope John Paul II, officially authorized a team of experts to unseal the tomb and examine its contents. For the archaeologists and the rest of the team involved, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study the remains of a major historical figure. On the morning of May 7, 1973, the stone sarcophagus was carefully opened by a crew of 12 researchers under the watchful eye of church officials. Inside, they found the decaying wooden coffins and skeletal remains of King Casimir and Queen Elizabeth, along with fragments of the burial garments and artifacts that had survived the centuries. Little did they know they were unleashing a very real burial curse upon themselves. The immediate goal of the project was to document and preserve the contents of the royal tomb. The remains were studied, the tomb interior was cleaned and stabilized, and plans were made to prevent further deterioration. Once this conservation work was completed, The royal remains were to be reverently reburied. Indeed, a few months later, on September 18th, 1973, a reinterment ceremony took place. The bones of Casimir and his queen were placed back into the sarcophagus, which was then resealed in the cathedral crypt. Everything about the excavation and reburial had proceeded according to plan. From a scientific and religious standpoint, it was a successful endeavor that combined historical curiosity with pious care for the deceased. Yet, in the months following the tomb's opening, a series of tragic events unfolded that no one had anticipated, casting a dark shadow over the project. Not long after Casimir's tomb was opened and the bodies were reinterred, members of the research and conservation team began to fall gravely ill or die under sudden, unexplained circumstances. The pattern emerged within a year of the tomb's disturbance. The first to die was the project's leading architect, who suffered a stroke in early 1974 and passed away. Soon after, the chief conservator at Wawel also died, reportedly of a similar cause. These deaths were alarming, but at first they might have been written off as tragic coincidences. Then a third member of the team, the head of the archaeological division, died unexpectedly, followed by another. Within about 2 years of the tomb's opening, 4 of the 12 team members had died prematurely. Ultimately, 10 of the 12 experts who had entered Casimir's tomb in 1973 died within a relatively short period after the project. Many of these individuals were middle-aged and had been in decent health. As news of the researchers' fate spread, the media and public began to whisper about a curse of Casimir. Observers couldn't help but draw parallels to the famous legend of Tutankhamun's curse in Egypt. In what would become a famous event, several members of Howard Carter's 1922 expedition died shortly after entering King Tut's tomb. The Polish press and international outlets picked up on the sensational story. A centuries-old king, disturbed in his resting place, seemingly exacting vengeance on those who had violated his tomb. The fact that the individual who had overseen the tomb opening became Pope John Paul II in 1978 significantly heightened global interest in the story in later years. Within a decade of the tomb's opening, as many as 15 people connected to the project had died according to some counts. This larger figure includes not only the original 12-man team, but also other personnel who handled the remains or artifacts. Whether the number was 10 or 15, it was clear that an unusually high proportion of those involved had met an untimely end. Some reportedly suffered respiratory ailments or infections, while others, as noted, died of sudden strokes or unexplained health failures. The clustering of these incidents in the aftermath of the tomb's disturbance led many to conclude that the curse was real. Family members of the deceased experts were left searching for answers, and the public imagination filled in the blanks with talk of divine punishment or mystical retribution. But even as the curse lore gained traction, scientists were hard at work investigating a more earthly culprit behind the deaths. In the months following the team members' deaths, samples were taken from inside Casimir's tomb and analyzed by microbiologists. Their investigation revealed something striking: the presence of an unusual fungus lurking in the stale air and dust of the sarcophagus. A Polish microbiologist ended up identifying spores of Aspergillus flavus, a toxic mold, in the tomb's environment. It appeared that this fungus had been growing on the decayed organic materials, such as the wooden coffin fragments, or even the royal garments, in the sealed chamber. Once the tomb was opened in 1973, millions of microscopic spores were released into the air, directly exposing the explorers who breathed them in. Far from being an ancient curse in the spiritual sense, the tomb might have unleashed a deadly biological agent, a curse of toxic mold. In the case of Casimir's tomb, the theory is that the investigators, upon opening the coffin, inhaled a concentrated dose of dormant spores that had accumulated over centuries. Fungal spores can remain viable for astonishing lengths of time in sealed crypts, with some research indicating such spores can lie dormant for hundreds of years. Sudden exposure to fresh air and human presence likely stirred up a cloud of invisible spores inside the tight confines of the coffin. Several of the scientists who worked in or around the open tomb later developed acute respiratory illnesses, consistent with severe fungal infections. In other words, what looked like a mystical curse was probably just a simple run-of-the-mill case of a medieval lethal biohazard unleashed upon researchers. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. In the middle of the 9th century, a Varangian Viking chieftain named Rurik is said to have been invited to rule over the restless towns of the Eastern Slavs. According to medieval chronicles, this event in the year 862 marked the birth of a new dynasty and the genesis of the polity that would eventually become the powerful Kievan Rus. For centuries, the tale of Rurik's arrival has been repeated as the founding legend of Russia. But was Rurik truly a historical person, or a figure of legend created to explain the origins of the first Russian state? The primary source for Rurik's story is the Russian Primary Chronicle, also called the Tale of Bygone Years, a history compiled by monks under Rurikid patronage in the early 12th century. This chronicle recounts that in the year 862, several East Slavic and Finnic tribes, tired of constant strife, decided to invite a wise foreign prince to rule over them. To ensure neutrality, they wanted a man from far away, who had no existing affiliations with the tribes, and wouldn't exhibit any inherent favoritism. The prince they summoned was Rurik, leader of a Norse tribe known as the Rus, who would give their name to the region and to the largest group of East Slavic people. According to the account, Rurik arrived with his brothers Cineas and Truvor and a large retinue, and the three divided authority among themselves. The oldest, Rurik, located himself at Novgorod, while the two others took over lesser towns in the region. Within a few years, Cineas and Truvor had both died, and Rurik consolidated their lands under his sole rule. Rurik's base of power was in the Novgorod region, near the Volkhov River. One variant of the chronicle tradition even claims that Rurik first settled at Staraya Ladoga, an important Viking trade settlement on Lake Ladoga, before moving to Novgorod. These details suggest that the chroniclers linked Rurik with known Viking enclaves of the time. Indeed, archaeological discoveries show that Staraya Ladoga had a strong Scandinavian presence by the 9th century, and perhaps even as early as the 8th century. Norse-style artifacts associated with Norse gods, and hoards of Persian silver coins have all been found there. These are proof that a Viking network was well established before Rurik's purported arrival. Such evidence makes it plausible that a Varangian leader like Rurik could have seized control of Ladoga and Novgorod in the mid-800s. The chronicle portrays Rurik's rule as legitimate and consensual. The tribes allegedly chose him to govern. Modern historians, however, approach this claim with skepticism. The Primary Chronicle was written over 2 centuries after Rurik's time, and had a political motive to legitimize the ruling dynasty of its author's era. It's likely that reality was messier, and perhaps Rurik was a warlord who took power by force, or arrived as a hired commander, and then usurped authority. The idea that the Slavs and Finns peacefully called a foreign prince may be partly a legend to justify why Norsemen found themselves ruling the region. That said, There are numerous examples of foreign princes being invited to rule regions in the medieval period, though these come from feudal societies rather than tribal ones. According to the chronicles, Rurik ruled in the north until his death, traditionally pinned in the year 879. After this, his kinsman Prince Oleg became regent for Rurik's young son Igor. Prince Oleg wielded substantial power and subsequently expanded the territory dramatically. In 882, Oleg led an expedition south, captured the city of Kiev from other Viking lords, and declared it the new capital of a united Varangian realm. This act joined the northern and southern centers and is often regarded as the formal beginning of the Kievan Rus' state. Oleg and later Igor, who reigned as Grand Prince from 912 to 945, thus cemented what Rurik had begun. They had successfully established a dynastic rule over a federation of East Slavic tribes stretching from Novgorod to Kiev. The dynasty that sprang from Rurik's line, the Rurikids, would continue to govern these lands for centuries. Rurik's descendants, through Igor and beyond, became the princes of Kiev and later the Grand Princes of Vladimir and Moscow, tracing their lineage back to the Varangian founder. This Rurikid dynasty remained in power until 1598, when the last Tsar of Rurik's bloodline died. While the main branch of the Rurikids died with Fyodor I, Vasily IV spent some years as a claimant to the Tsardom during the times of trouble. Rurik's story has figured prominently in the historic debate between Normanist and anti-Normanist schools of thought. The Normanist view holds that the founders of the early East Slavic states, Rurik and his followers, were Norsemen who imported their leadership and helped form the early state. The anti-Normanist perspective, on the other hand, downplays or denies the Varangians' role, insisting that the East Slavs' development didn't depend on outsiders. In earlier centuries, this debate often had nationalistic overtones, as some Russian historians were reluctant to acknowledge that a Viking from abroad could have founded the Russian state. Today, evidence strongly favors the Normanist position. Multidisciplinary research, including archaeology and linguistics, confirms a significant Scandinavian presence in the 9th century East Slavic lands. Most modern historians conclude that the Varangians were indeed Norsemen who became a ruling elite and gradually assimilated with Eastern Slavs over the following centuries. The Normanist theory is now mainstream, whereas modern anti-Normanist claims are generally regarded as historical revisionism, driven more by ideology than by evidence. In other words, while the exact degree of Norse influence can be debated, the mainstream scholarly consensus acknowledges a Scandinavian origin for Rurik and the early Rus' leadership. Even accepting the Norse contribution, historians continue to debate the historicity of Rurik himself. The chronicles are our only direct source on Rurik's life, and they mix factual events with legend. Some scholars have treated Rurik as an actual chief who really did rule Novgorod, while suspecting that the tales of his brothers, Cineas and Truvor, were mythical additions. Other scholars have argued that Rurik was a largely legendary figure, a convenient fiction to personify the establishment of Varangian rule. Under this theory, Vikings did establish rule in the region, but there was no individual named Rurik. The true founder of the Varangian states in the era were lost to time, and the later chroniclers simply invented tales which broadly conformed to what they knew of history. Some have even tried to equate Rurik with Rorik of Dorestad, a 9th century Viking documented in Western Europe. The theory that Rorik of Dorestad and Rurik of Novgorod were the same person is built on circumstantial but compelling evidence. The strongest argument comes from the chronological overlap. Rorik, a Danish Viking who ruled parts of Frisia under Frankish overlordship is last mentioned in Western European records around 873. Around this same time, Rurik is said to have begun ruling in Novgorod, according to the primary chronicle, which places his arrival in 862. Rurik's sudden disappearance from Frankish sources and Rurik's sudden appearance in Eastern ones have led some to see a possible connection. Also, it's notable that the years are less than 10 years off from one another. This can be explained by the Western sources on Rurik being contemporary, while the primary chronicle came much later. The names themselves are also noteworthy, and Rurik are considered variants of the same Old Norse name. Another clue lies in Rurik's known background. He had extensive experience as a ruler under the Carolingians, and would have been familiar with managing tribute, diplomacy, and warfare. These are the very skills Rurik is described as bringing to the fragmented Slavic and Finnic tribes in Eastern Europe. The primary chronicle claims local tribes invited Rurik and his kin to bring order, something a politically seasoned figure like Rurik could plausibly have done. Still, there are limitations, and the primary chronicle doesn't explicitly link Rurik to Novgorod or mention Frisia at all. Further, we generally like to view the Viking world as segmented, viewing what was going on in the Volga region and Eastern Europe as being separate from Western Europe. This is a view that some historians believe wouldn't have been adopted by Norse people themselves. Norse adventurers traveled long distances routinely. In this light, the idea that a Norseman could serve the Carolingians as a vassal and then subsequently establish a tribal kingdom in Eastern Europe isn't implausible. All that said, most historians view the Rurik theory as interesting and speculative, but ultimately impossible to prove based on the present evidence. Further archaeological evidence, such as a find indicating some sort of link between Frisia and Novgorod, may enhance this possibility, depending on what the evidence is. In light of such perspectives, Rurik is best described as a semi-legendary founding figure, based on the evidence as it presently stands. The general consensus is that it's most likely there was a real Viking leader in the 9th century who established himself around Novgorod. While he may not have been named Rurik or done the exact things Rurik did, somebody did something extremely similar. In that sense, Rurik most certainly exists, even if he would be puzzled if you referred to him by that name.